where exactly did we get last week? And we discussed cultural ecology.
I think so. I think that's where we left off.
Okay.
That's yeah. And then we said we're gonna continue on page 115, which is the human ecology and
Uh-huh.
principle of common good. And the last one is justice between generations.
Uh-huh.
That's the last. That's the last title of the
Right.
chapter 4.
Right. The common good and
Yeah.
intergenerational solidarity.
Yeah.
So human ecology, um, or daily ecology, I think he calls it both, is the setting and the environment in which we live our daily lives. And particularly for the poor, that environment and that setting has broken down very badly. Uh, so he talks about the breakdown of urban communities where there's garbage, no nature, violence, abuse, fear, ugliness, drug addiction. Um, and so the problem is that our environment often causes us to think in a particular way and to treat one another in the same way in which we're treated and we experience life. So, um, kind of a sort of striking thing, sort of related to that is that children who are victims of abuse themselves tend to be abusers.
Yeah.
Um, we often see, people who are victims of racism often tend to react violently when and in fact, in many ways, that's what when Jesus calls on us to love our enemy, in many ways, I think that's part of what he's trying to address, that there's this cycle of violence that when you're oppressed, you hate. And so you hate your oppressor and you try to use every opportunity to get back at them. And then they simply try to get back at you and they have more weapons at their disposal to do that. So that means that you have to in turn get back at them, which means that they have to in turn get back at you.
There's no ending, like a cycle.
And we have this never ending cycle of violence.
Yeah.
Um, and so there's no hope and there's no way in which the cycle can ever be broken out of
Yeah.
unless something dramatic happens. So for Jesus, that's the call to love our enemy. And I mean, I think that's really very important. But so there's this enormous ugliness that's spreading. And then also in rural communities, he talks about the isolation of rural communities, that people, particularly say migrant or undocumented workers in
Yeah.
rural communities are,
Yeah.
sort of very segregated and isolated. Rural communities themselves are isolated. Um, and
Well, yeah. Have you seen the farm workers? They have this little hut that they live in, and
yeah,
each one of those hut is like a whole family. There could be three children there, two children, the husband and wife, and a just a small, house,
Out in the middle of the farm.
Yeah, and I don't know whether they have running water there. or a toilet or any of those. You don't know.
Yeah, yeah, I would think not.
Yeah,
Yeah,
There's birth defects and everything. I mean, they have to work with pesticides and all that kind of stuff.
yeah,
yeah, yeah. Meat packing plants also are in, typically rural areas. They're um, predominantly staffed by Latinos,
yeah,
and they've been. I mean, besides the fact that the working conditions are horrendous, I mean, they've been real breeding grounds for coronavirus, and the fatality rate has been really high. Um,
and their wages is not really good either.
no, wages are really horrendous, and
Yeah,
obviously wages for undocumented workers are even more horrendous since they're usually working off the books. They don't have to be paid minimum wage,
right,
and
exactly.
the reality is you can't live on minimum wage.
Yeah.
You can't even come close to living on minimum wage if you're
Not
a
nowadays.
single earner in a family,
Yeah,
and they're paid less, which is sort of very grim. The I haven't been to New York for a long time. We left New York in 1989, but large parts of New York looked like war zones, just in
wow.
terms of the disintegration of housing. I mean, you would swear if you went into many neighborhoods like Brownsville and Bed-Stuy that you were walking into something that had just survived, like the Nuremberg fire bombings. I mean,
Wow.
just the degree of devastation from neglect and decay, and people often were living in those buildings and paying rent in those buildings even more outrageously. Um, it may have changed, but if it's changed, it's only changed because the people who are living there have been driven out, and they've better, expensive housing has been built, and now,
Right,
um,
yeah.
but so um, yeah, so daily and human ecology. The sad fact, I mean, is that we live in a society that has very little respect for human life, and that's reflected in daily ecology. Many people live their lives without hope and without a way out because there doesn't appear to be any way out. We have this myth that everyone can pull themselves up by the bootstraps, but that isn't true. And as our society has changed, American society has changed. It's becoming less and less true. We're even seeing downward mobility in the middle class. Um, the Holy Father talks about the importance of home ownership and the fact that it's becoming inaccessible to the children of the privileged, because property values are growing so high.
But some of the poor people or middle class people work two jobs just to get by. Just
Right.
I saw families that has like maybe 4 or 5 kids. Both parents are working two jobs
Right.
just to support their families.
Hmm. Right. And then the problem is that when everyone is working all those hours,
Yeah.
the children are often without guidance or supervision. And
Right.
and it's not like there's an alternative. I mean, if you're struggling to survive and you need to work those jobs, and nobody works two jobs because they're for the sheer enjoyment and pleasure,
Yeah.
then,
No.
then
Yeah.
obviously you can't hire somebody to watch your children
No, because it's
because you can
kind of
barely feed them. What what he also points to, which is kind of amazing, is the way in which communities have created beauty in the midst of, their objectively ugly conditions. With sometimes urban pocket gardens,
yeah.
sometimes with art painted onto buildings, which, although it's considered graffiti, can really be quite beautiful and very, very creative. Um,
They
A
got
lot of that in San Diego.
yeah, there was a lot of it in New York. Um, you know, Actually, somebody, or I'm sure it was a group of people, there was one particularly kind of sort of bombed out building,
Mhm.
that looked like it was falling apart. So people had put plywood over the boarded up windows and painted them so that they looked like windows, and they had painted like, you know,
Flower boxes.
flower boxes. Yes, yes.
Yeah.
And so when you saw the building, until you looked carefully and realized it, was uninhabitable and
Yeah.
going to fall apart at any moment, it looked beautiful. It was sort of a real testimony to using the tools at hand, to doing what you can to try to beautify your neighborhood at least a little bit. So so even in the midst of the squalor, there's an enormous hope. So the Holy Father also says, in those situations, displacement is not a good option. There's this tendency to move people out, and then you simply break up communities. You isolate people so that they're even more powerless, and then ultimately they get dumped anyway. Um,
But they don't give him any place to go. They just,
no,
yeah,
they don't. Right,
yeah. They said, oh, we're gonna build here, so you guys are out. So they don't know whether they're gonna have family to go to. So it's really hard.
right. It's really hard. So there's a need for adequate and safe housing, especially for the poor, but actually even for working and middle class people. There's a need for building systems of mass transit with safe and effective public transit, given that cars generate pollution, they require more roads
Mm.
and more parking spaces. Um, and then, in cities, people spend hours in their cars with
Yeah,
their cars running, right?
yeah,
I would, when we lived in New York, I mean, most people in New York don't own cars, but there's this huge influx of people from like New Jersey and Long Island, and many of them commute. And some people commute up to like 3 hours each way. So that's
public transportation. Yeah.
no, but these are people driving.
Oh, driving.
Yeah,
Oh,
I mean, you can. There's also really good public transportation, both with buses particularly from New Jersey and the Long Island Railroad from Long Island and then the whatever it's called in upstate New York, from Connecticut and upstate New York. There's a really good commuter railroad, but a lot of people, I mean, there's this that, that's part of the interaction of culture and human ecology, that a lot of people prefer their privacy, and so they prefer to drive. And they feel
And
like
hours.
if they feel like if they can't drive, then they're giving up some important freedom. So they prefer to drive the 6 hours a day
And work
than
8 hours. Yeah.
But there
than
has been a trend just recently where young people don't even want to get a license.
yeah.
And I don't know what's causing that. Because it's not just one kid that I know didn't even want to get a car. It's at least two, maybe even three.
Where do they live?
Well, one of them is my nephew in Toronto. I mean, he just didn't even get a driver's license. And usually
Yeah.
that's one of the things that kids look forward to, right?
Yeah.
My girlfriend's daughter
Unfortunately, yeah.
Yeah.
in the Bay Area, thing with him. He couldn't be bothered getting a driver's license. He didn't want to drive. And it's really, I mean, in the Bay Area, the transportation system wasn't that great. In Toronto, at least, we've got tons of buses and streetcars.
Toronto, it's good. Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, he had that option, but I don't know. I just I don't know what's causing that trend. Some kids just couldn't be. I mean, I don't know whether it's because they don't have the money to buy a car, and they know they have to buy insurance, and then they have to buy gas to keep it going, and the maintenance and all that. I mean,
And parking.
if there
Yeah.
isn't any
Yeah.
jobs,
In
yeah.
some places, parking is about the equivalent of a rent.
Mhm.
Yeah. Oh,
My
my,
fir-
yeah, right.
I bought
Gee.
my first car in 1993 when I was
Really?
42 years old.
Wow.
And I was not pleased about it either. I did, I didn't, I mean, we had to have a car because we were living, in Sonoma County, but with no good public transportation. But
Yeah. Yeah.
it struck me as being an outrageous waste of money.
Oh.
Um,
Well, when we were in Hawaii, we could afford a car. So you know what I do? I take the taxi to go to commissary to buy food, and take the bus when I take my kids to the clinic.
uh-huh.
In Pearl Harbor, because the bus is stopped right there in front of the base, so you can
Right.
just walk a little bit. That's what we did for how many years? We didn't buy a car until we're almost leaving Hawaii.
Yeah.
We've been there for 12 years.
Yeah.
Just yeah, bus and taxi, because you can't bring all these groceries in the bus. So I
No.
had to take the taxi.
Yeah. In New York, I always took the subway, which I really
Mhm.
enjoyed riding. The subway system was just great, and it ran 24 hours.
Right?
And
Yeah.
and it was safe, for the
Yeah.
most part.
Yeah.
So it was, yeah.
Yeah, there's public transportation in Washington D.C. I went there before. It was really great.
Mhm.
They have all this what you call a train, yeah, and you can go all the way to New Jersey, with a train.
The common good,
Yeah, that was yeah. I was wondering about that. I read it, but
which he defines as the sum of those conditions of social life which allow social groups and their individual members relatively thorough and ready access to their own fulfillment.
there you go, on fulfillment.
Mhm. The common good should be based on respect for the human person who is
Yeah,
endowed with inalienable rights, concern for the overall welfare of society, concern for intermediate groups like the family, concern for social peace, stability, and security, concern for distributive justice. And he notes that where justice is absent, its violation always produces violence, which in many ways is what Jesus is addressing when he tells us to love our enemy. And so the problem in terms of the common good is that the reality is that injustices abound and growing numbers of people are deprived of basic human rights and are considered expendable. And so the common good requires a summons to solidarity and a preferential option for the poorest, because the poorest are the most expendable. Thinking about the common good, I mean, in our culture particularly, thinking about the common good requires a real change of the mode of thinking, given that we think about ourselves and we rarely think about the common good.
Well, even thinking that the government's going to take care of situations like handing out money, for basics, when number one, it's not enough anyway. And number two, then they're taxed on it. And then they give them exemptions for not having to pay their rent on time. But then when that's over, they're expected to come up with all the rent that they owed. It's like,
Right.
what? I mean, what were you doing to help them?
Right.
They're in worse shape than they were when they started.
Right. Yeah, I mean, the coronavirus is kind of
A real test.
it's kind of an extreme example, but we see examples of it every day. Like, so if you get into credit card debt, you can transfer your money to, like get
Yeah.
another credit card with interest free. And then when
Yeah.
the time expires, you get hit with this even more exorbitant interest rate. So it seems to be good for a little while, but
Yeah.
in the end, it ends up being worse. The entire credit system is, in many ways, sort of fundamentally unfair. And the basic problem is that most people run into difficulty, credit-wise, not because they're cheating or looking to avoid their bills or whatever, but because they have a crisis, right? And the crisis can happen to any of us. A major thing is health. Any of us can become seriously ill with enormous medical costs at any given time, or we can have accidents, bad things happening around us, bad things happening to our family and children. I mean, just that there's a limitless list of possibilities, and we're all vulnerable to it. Even,
And
whether
even
we're
without a crisis or without an emergency, I mean, they're offering these low student interest loans, and then they end up going, graduating and then having these loans that they have for years. They
right,
don't pay them off.
right,
Um,
right,
and that just seems more of a burden than to demand the money up front,
right, right. And loans, a problem with loans, I mean, for many people, many students go to school well, to learn. It's not supposed to,
To get a good job.
it's not supposed to happen, but sometimes, there's, and so, you incur this enormous debt, and for some students, the point of the whole thing is not necessarily, that you're going to get a job in X. It's that you're going to learn, and then, the job will take care of itself. I mean, so like, well, I was going to be an academic, but, I wanted to, so when I went to graduate school, there were almost no academic jobs available, but I was still, sort of convinced that I would be, sort of in the running. So I went to graduate school without getting a fellowship, which meant I had to pay all my own way to Columbia, which is extremely expensive.
Mm.
So, I had, and, this is in the 70s. So, the cost has skyrocketed since, but at the
Yeah,
time,
oh, yeah.
it was comparatively outrageous. So I finished, with an enormous amount of student debt and left before I got my PhD. Although, academic jobs didn't pay that well, and probably still don't anyway. So, there's this huge debt you have to pay, and, you're not going to get a job that's in any way going to really begin
Be
to
related.
help you repay it. And yeah, so I mean, there's this. So that's kind of another trap: student loan debt. The entire way loans work is often highly exploitative. Um, there was a period when they were really pushing what were they called, variable rate mortgages, when the interest rate was low, right? So you get something, a loan at, probably then it was in the 3%, and it just looks great. And of course, the interest rate is only going to go down from here, only it's not. It skyrockets upward, and you're ruined.
Yeah.
So that's the economic ecology impacting the human ecology. And the sad thing in our world is that almost all of the impacts on the human ecology in our day and age seem to tend to be negative ones.
Mm.
There's very little positive that's going on. And yeah. So we need a profound reorientation away from ourselves toward the common good. And one of the ways in which the lack of a concern for the common good is played out is with the coronavirus.
Oh yeah, coronavirus. Yes.
People
Yeah.
losing their jobs, not having money for rent and housing, and then cost of food rising.
Everything goes up.
Everything's going up.
Right.
Really? Who's going to buy it? I mean, seriously, if people are losing their jobs.
Well, the hoarders are.
Oh,
It's
so sad. It's so sad. There's just, for the common good, there's no common good.
no.
No.
The basic principle is look out for number one, and
And the big conglomerates, right? And the big
right.
I mean, some organizations have actually increased in their profit margins because of coronavirus.
Oh, enormously, yeah. Yeah,
Sad.
yeah,
I mean, it's sad to see the homeless, and they're out there in the parks, and they're turning to drugs and alcohol, and there's just it's just an endless vicious cycle that we're in
right.
for them. I mean, and it's growing. It's not getting worse, getting better. I mean, these people.
Not getting better, right?
Oh, it's
It's a
getting.
vicious cycle in a number of ways. You know,
Yeah.
it's not only that those lives are degraded, but also, you know, their potential is lost. What they have to give to society, their contribution to the common good is erased and negated.
Mm.
Um,
And there's more joining them every day.
there's more joining them every day, right? And the problem is once you find yourself in that situation, the natural escape will be drugs and alcohol. I mean, that helps to blunt the pain a little bit. Um, so, I mean, it's just a tragic situation. And, you know, then we have, you know, the cultural ecology, which tends to blame the homeless for being homeless, as if, you know, somebody, as if, you know, a 12-year-old kid says, one day I would love to be homeless.
Yeah.
Now that's my goal. I'm gonna go for it. And
Well,
so,
it's really sad to see those young people. You know, like when we go shopping at Winco, right in the corners, a young person. You know, maybe it's not even 20. You know, panhandling.
yeah,
You know, and then there's a family of two or three with the father and mother right in there in the corner. You know, help. They said help for food. They're not even asking for rent. They're asking for food. Help for food. You know, to buy
yeah,
food. So it's really sad that government cannot do anything with it. You know, like I don't know, build shelter or something. I don't know.
yeah. And yeah, the problem is just becoming massive and it's I mean
And
happening everywhere
yeah,
and it's even
mostly
happening.
mostly all the churches is the one helping. You know, the homeless. You know,
We're getting a lot of calls at the church for
yeah,
St. Vincent de Paul's help with
yeah,
rent right now because the I guess the time frame is now up for
Uh-huh.
for the that you don't have to pay your rent,
yeah,
Right.
yeah,
and the phone calls are coming in like crazy.
yeah. Let's do that. Yeah.
Yeah. So intergenerational solidarity. You know, the kind of, you know, forgetting that we're number one and forgetting that we should look out for number one is kind of for our culture counterintuitive, but you would think that people, everyone would at least be willing to kind of take a look and ask what kind of future are we leaving for our children.
Oh, we're all going to be moving to Mars.
That's true.
Right? We're
You
looking
know,
for another place to live.
I forgot about that. Yeah,
It's ridiculous. ridiculous. I mean, really, I'm not against space exploration, but
That's
the
too
money
much,
that's going
much
into that,
money. Too much money involved in that, that exploration to go to Mars.
yeah. Well, I
Billions
don't
of
mind
dollars.
doing that as long as we're taking care of the homeless at the same time.
Yeah.
And because of all the, the poverty and all that in the country. If we're
Right.
taking care of everything like that, then okay, go ahead and do some exploration. But if there's problems, we better take care of Earth first,
Yeah.
you know.
So what do they think? The Earth is gonna disappear. That's why we gotta move to Mars.
Going from 12,000 down to 2 miles an hour in 7 minutes. I don't know how any human's going to be able to withstand that.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's yeah, we've got a lot of stuff to clean up. So as far as the generational thing,
Well,
The we typically see our children as doing better than we have done. Isn't that true?
we
Or
always want that
want
for
them
them.
to, want
Yeah.
them to. That's always a goal. But that's becoming less and less likely. And our society has more downward mobility than American society, at least, has more downward mobility than it has upward mobility. The concentration of wealth in the hands of the very wealthy has reached absurd proportions. There's very little upward mobility going on. And so you would think that the question of what future are we leaving our children is, kind of really should emerge front and center, even ignoring global warming. And the fact is, we may not even be leaving an Earth to our children, in which case there's no place to live because Mars is really not a viable option. Although I do recall Trump making a comment about we can all go to Mars.
We don't even know if there's oxygen over there that we can breathe.
Oxygen is for wimps.
We should tell Trump to go first.
Yeah, yeah. So one of the striking things that related to intergenerational solidarity is that Pope Francis said doomsday predictions cannot be met with irony or disdain. So I thought that was an interesting comment. For many people, doomsday predictions are about the second coming,
Yeah.
but he's not talking about the second coming.
Yeah, he's talking about coronavirus.
Yeah, and he's talking about the end of the earth and our destroying it, which
Yeah.
Because we don't know how to take care of it.
because we don't know how to take care of it.
There's a few people and few organizations that's started doing things, but not enough.
Yeah, there are actually an enormous number of organizations that have been,
Yeah.
doing things in various areas. But no, it's not enough. what Francis says is an ethical and cultural decline has accompanied the deterioration of the environment. So he talks about rampant individualism and a culture of instant gratification.
Mhm.
And that's a real, in many ways, I think, in part driving this is that ethical and cultural decline and that belief that everything is about me. Look out for number one. And that's just, it's, in many ways, I mean, I think it's really hard to see, especially given for our society, the way in which, our society is just profoundly individualistic. And that's, that's true of, almost that's just a rampant theme in our society. It's true of Christianity, especially of evangelical Christianity, where, God, taking prosperity theology, God is going to bless me,
Yeah.
or even I am going to go to heaven.
Yeah. I will be saved.
To hell with everyone else. I mean,
Yeah.
they can go to hell, but I'm going to heaven. And just staggering, refusing to wear masks, refusing to, not go to church. We have a right to assemble without masks. And just, who cares about anyone else? So addressing all of these issues is not going to be easy. And it takes dialogue and listening to everyone. But also, I mean, there's a real underlying everything. There has to be a sense of morality and ethics. And the church, or at least a portion of the church, is in a good position to provide the morality and ethics. I think that's been an important part of the goal of the relationship of Catholicism with science, that Catholicism and the Vatican Academy of Sciences, that it's seen itself, an important part of its work, in addition to pure scientific research, as providing an ethical and moral foundation for scientific research and scientific exploration. And that can also be true of the ecology movement and the struggle against poverty and the attempt to safeguard our common home. So what I thought we might do is discuss the Texas crisis.
Yeah.
In terms of looking at the components of that go into integral ecology.
Okay.
I thought I've been reading a good deal about this, and it's really sort of interesting. So the starting point of it is kind of a cultural ecology. The Texas has this sort of distinctive culture that sees itself as independent
Yeah.
and
They wanna
really
be, yeah.
champions that. Although, if we look at it kind of historically, it's not anything you would want to exactly write home about.
Yeah.
I mean, so like a good example is the Alamo, which has been kind of idealized, and there are these freedom fighters fighting for independence from Mexico. But at the point that they were fighting for independence from Mexico, Mexico had undergone a democratic revolution and was much more democratic than the United States.
Oh,
So it wasn't that they were fighting for freedom, they were really fighting against freedom, for their own personal freedom. That included slavery, which had been abolished in Mexico.
yeah. Wow.
So, this kind of myth of freedom is in fact the very antithesis of freedom. It's, this fundamentally reactionary, retrograde movement against freedom, or at least against freedom for all, to preserve the freedom of the few, which is, not freedom.
Hmm.
So that seemed, that kind of culture of individualism and exclusivity seemed to make it a good idea to not be connected to the Eastern and Western power grids.
They're in a big trouble now.
And besides,
Yeah.
what can go wrong? Texas produces most of the energy.
Is this the problem with the shoemaker thing?
They
They
don't want.
they
They don't
take
want.
care of everybody else but themselves.
They don't want to help the government. Plus, they want to be their own state too. They want to recede from, from all the, the government here, the state. They want to be on their own completely.
Yeah. Yeah. So that in many ways, I think, that culture of individualism is sort of the starting point. And this notion of self-sufficiency, and self-sufficiency is always a good thing to take a careful look at, because in the real world, we're interdependent. And that's ignoring even the threat of violence and war that comes from it, national xenophobia or xenophobic nationalism is, dangerous, because no nation can be self-sufficient. And in Texas, even if we were to consider it, accorded the status of a nation, can't be self-sufficient. So
They think they can be.
they think they can be, but the problem is it's an illusion, and
Yeah.
at some point, the illusion comes crashing down, brings everything crashing down. So then we have a culture and a cultural ecology that promotes exclusivity and individualism and self-sufficiency, and then the economics, right? So the one of the things, so the promise was that this would bring cheap energy,
Yeah.
right? Low energy prices, because there's no federal regulation, because
Yeah.
they have their own grid that's not connected to the Eastern and the Western grids, so they don't have to comply with federal regulations. So the result will be less regulation and therefore lower energy costs, which was true. But actually, and in part, that goes back to cultural ecology. Is probably, I think, probably more than any other culture that I've experience, Americans respond to prices and money. So people tend to vote based on how the economy is doing. And that's typically, the number one priority and the thing that most defines how you vote. But, if you kind of look at it, that's a silly way to vote because the economy is, variable. And the broader question, should be which candidate most closely, which candidate's policies most closely resemble ones that you support. But instead of that, all of that goes out the window. And, as long as the economy is doing well, you can support a horrible candidate because the economy is doing well, so he must be responsible, even though there the evidence, that the relationship between a particular president and the state of the economy is weak. So low energy prices, that sounds good. We should really get behind this. So, of course, why take a look if you're going to get low energy prices?
I guess they didn't study that very well before they decided to do that.
No.
I mean, they didn't look at all the, the aspect.
Well, I mean,
of what's gonna happen,
whoever does. So then we have exceptionalism, we have low energy prices, we have no federal regulation. And so that means that there are no rules, effectively, right? So the intention here, there was also an ecological component to this, or the movement had support from the ecology movement, evidently. It's hard to say what what the relevant proportions are, but for the ecology supporters, the deregulation meant that it would be easy for alternate energy providers, and particularly for providers of solar and wind energy, to establish businesses and become viable and reduce Texas's the oil imprint and the fossil fuel imprint in Texas, and so that this would be a viable way to sort of jumpstart a decreasing dependence on fossil fuel, which evidently partly has happened, although the solar and wind energy were also blamed by some for the crisis. But the basic problem is that since there's no regulation, there's almost no rules, and the rules are lax. So for example, the basic problem actually came from the fact that the natural gas supply disappeared because particularly pipes responsible for distributing natural gas froze.
Oh.
So now also the Dakotas are major suppliers of natural gas. But you don't see theirs freezing, right? Because they're regulated, and you have to have heated pipes to cover exactly this contingency. But of course, back to the culture of exceptionalism, Texas has a great climate, right? It's always warm.
That's right.
And
they never thought they're gonna snow.
So why would you want to heat your pipes?
Yeah.
So we have this economic ecology of no regulation and cutting corners, because now everyone's competing and you want to deliver cheap energy, right? So when corners are being cut, obviously things become more risky. And so, we see what happens. And then we have the social ecology. So wealthy people like Ted Cruz can
Yeah.
go to Cancun,
Yeah, just leave the country for now.
just leave the country or leave the
Until
state,
the crisis is over.
or even go to El Paso, which is on the national grid and not on the Western grid and not on the Texas grid.
I didn't know that. Oh.
Yeah, there's some communities in Texas that are on the national grid or the Western grid and not on the Texas grid. So they haven't experienced this crisis.
They're the humble ones.
They're the humble ones. So and so the ultimate effect is especially felt by the poor.
Yeah, mostly.
Mostly, yeah. I mean, many middle class people can afford to buy like generators and generate some electricity,
Yeah.
keep stuff running. But for the poor, that's totally out of well, not possible, not even conceivable. So the impact falls disproportionately. I mean, it falls, disproportionately in inverse proportion to your wealth ultimately. So just an amazing crisis, completely of, human making, with its underlying causes being kind of arrogance, presumption, stupidity, short-sightedness, and looking for the short term. And the result is that people suffer.
Yeah.
And people suffer enormously, and people die. And I'm sure there are things I missed. Can anyone think of them?
Well, I think it was yesterday news, CNN. They were charging the citizens of Texas $700
Or
for the electricity that they don't even have, for the power.
Yeah,
Yeah, $700.
what?
yeah. I've heard of some bills that are going to be like $4,000 and $5,000.
Really, yeah.
Because the problem is that, given that they're not regulated, ultimately the producers or the energy providers pass on the cost of their energy to the consumers, right?
Yeah, to the citizens, right?
There's
Yeah.
no regulation. And
There
so
goes the low cost energy.
energy is expensive, right? So there goes the low cost energy. And, I mean, who can pay?
Yeah.
And it's not necessarily the case that, the people getting these outrageous bills are all wealthy and can afford to pay them. The cost of energy has gone up dramatically because there is none.
Yeah.
Or very little. And so anybody can get an outrageous bill. And, how are you going to pay, a $4,000, $5,000, or $700 bill? That's not in the range of feasibility for most people. Right. And so there goes cheap energy.
This is the end result of it.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, if you step back and, not realize the enormous impact that this has on human lives. This is like, a parade of fools and a comedy routine. I mean, it's like, what are these people thinking of? But the sad thing is, the sad thing is we do that all the time. We always take best case scenarios, right?
Yeah.
It's like, it happened again, with Trump economics, that we're going to deregulate everything because, we'll let corporate America, sort of police itself and run itself, and we don't want regulation. But what happens when there's no regulation?
Yeah.
It's you let the fox into the chicken coop.
Right.
And the purpose of the state is fundamentally to serve as an institution that appears to stand above society to ensure that there's a modicum of fairness. And that's what the state is intended to do. But when you dismantle all of the apparatus to do that, then you end up with a state that really just enforces the power of the wealthy, which is what has really happened over the last 4 years. And we have the
So-
economic institutions of the state have largely tended to deregulate and allow the rich to do what they want. The Department of Justice has largely focused on dismantling most of the kind of rules of previous administrations designed to support justice, and instead has pursued trivial offenses like Jeff Sessions and marijuana offenders.
Yeah.
When and so the Department of Justice has become, the very inverse. It's become the Department of Injustice, and the entire state has been really a tool for ensuring that the wealthy become wealthier. Similarly, the tax cuts, the elimination of the estate tax, just insane. And all of it done under the mirage of making America great again, which, of course, it didn't. It made America a laughingstock.
So the question is, what is the government official of Texas doing about this problem? Is there any solution that they present?
No, as I
Really?
as I recall, um, Abbott blamed solar and wind power for the crisis, and there's a lot of sort of emphasis on on that, and also on the fact that this was a once in a century storm. So who could have foreseen
Who
it
could
coming?
predict it? Right. Yeah.
Right. But the problem is that at this point we're seeing more and more once in a century storms
Yeah.
hitting.
Like a big flood that they have
Yeah,
last year.
yeah,
Right.
and hurricanes
Yeah.
and horrible weather and snowstorms, and I mean we're seeing those once in a century storms somewhere every year,
Yeah.
and sometimes in the same place 2 years in a row,
Yeah.
which is less than a century apart by about 99 years. So
Yeah.
so our world is changing,
Yeah.
and it may be that the problem, I mean, it may be that those changes will finally cause enough people to take notice that it's taken seriously.
Yeah.
But
Well, I
there's
hope
still,
so. Yeah.
yeah, but there's still, there's still a lot of, climate deniers and deniers that there's a problem at all. I mean, no biggie, this just happened.
Yeah.
Um, back to Genesis. The
Yeah.
woman made me do it. The snake made me do it. Nobody is
Nobody wants to take
for their
responsibility.
for
Yeah.
their part in the fiasco. And part of the human ecology is that we have to take responsibility for what we've done. That's probably the hardest thing because, I think, as Genesis shows, we don't. I mean, it's endemic to the human condition that we just don't like to take responsibility for what we've done. It's always somebody else's fault. Somebody did it to me.
Yeah.
Somebody made me do it. I didn't know. It's a dismal record of irresponsibility.
Mm.
Very, very sad. But there is hope. I think that there's hope from the fact that as change intensifies, people will begin to take notice and will become, irrefutable. We already, I mean, the science behind climate change is well established.
Right.
It's simply, individually, we need to promote science to make it clear that as a community of faith, as Catholics, we believe in science.
Right.
The Holy Father points to poor communities creating beauty in the midst of this ugliness. That is a real sign of hope. That the poor and the oppressed often are the source of change. That despite the fact that they should be angry and violent,
Yeah.
they nevertheless find constructive solutions to serious problems and solutions that are life affirming rather than continue to play into a culture of death. And then there, in many ways, particularly in Latin America, there have been some major movements of resistance from the poor to stop like mining operations and strip mining that would have destroyed their communities. In the United States, we had that huge opposition to the Keystone Pipeline from Native American tribes as well as environmental activists, which and now Biden is planning to stop the construction of the pipeline, which already has had a number of leakages, in spite of the fact that it's not completed. So there's hope. We just, I think need to look at the linkages and focus on integral ecology as the Holy Father suggests. I think it's a really valuable. I mean, this chapter is really valuable because it helps us to not see each individual problem as kind of this isolated thing. So we can begin to take a look at everything in a broader context, and in that way kind of understand what's happening and how it can be combated. So although it's a late hour, there is hope.
Sometimes when there's a crisis like this, though, people do come together. And it does come from the bottom up.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
So
that's very true.
in this, and I'm thinking in this situation, that's what's going to happen. It's
Yeah, yeah. Crises often bring out the best in us, sometimes the worst of some, but generally the best of very many. And that's a
Yeah,
really important thing.
they kind of united together
Mhm.
to do, to help.
Yeah,
Yeah,
at
there.
at times where we are able to put aside our egos and our selfishness and to think about others and to look forward to what to raise the question of what kind of future
Yeah.
we're building for
Uh-huh.
ourselves, and
Well,
that's really important.
we lost power last night.
Oh, really?
Yeah, just for we didn't know what happened because the wind is really blowing. So we
Yeah,
have candles, So we
yeah,
thought about our new neighbor to our right. She's by herself. Is older lady. So I told Cody, I said, go over there and ask her if she has some candles. So Cody brought a candle and a flashlight, and so she knocked on the door, and the lady answered the door, and Cody said, do you have any candy? And I said, oh, yeah, I have a small one. Oh, here it is. I said, how come you are so nice?
oh,
He told Cody, and Cody said, because you're our neighbor, you know.
oh,
Yeah,
yeah,
uh-huh,
yeah, yeah. So, but it didn't take very long. I think about like probably 45 minutes. We got our thing.
oh,
But we have lantern. We have the Scorman lantern that we have, with battery. So we have a couple of those. So I told Cody, so I just give this candle to our next door neighbor.
yeah.
Yeah. So,
hmm
things like that. I think little things really means a lot, for people.
Mhm.
yeah, yeah.
I mean, this thing in Texas was tragic, very tragic.
It's very
People
tragic.
were losing all the food in their refrigerators, and then the water mains were frozen and
Yeah,
cracking.
yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, you see apartment building on fire and nobody can put it out because
yeah,
there's no water. There's no water to be
right,
had.
Yeah.
yeah,
Oh,
yeah,
I wonder if somebody's tracking water to every houses.
yeah,
yeah. And in apartment buildings, no water because
yeah,
that's driven by electricity, of which there is none.
yeah.
Wow.
Yeah,
And how many people have died so far? Is it 1,000?
yeah, something like that. Yeah, yeah,
Well, because it's too cold, or
Just because of everything,
yeah,
everything.
yeah. I
No
mean,
food, no electricity, no
no
heat,
water, no food.
yeah,
no,
and
no, yeah,
you
They
know,
cannot cook unless they have some canned goods or something.
for people who depend on like emergency devices,
Right.
those aren't working either. So,
Yeah.
right.
uh,
There's only so much barbecue you can do if you don't only have one tank of propane.
Yeah.
And then you end up in a line trying to get your propane tank refilled.
Mm.
right,
And
right,
it's cold out. And wow.
yeah,
Wow. That's the worst thing I have ever seen. The worst disaster.
That's what I was talking to my mom this afternoon. It's almost better to have like a Winnebago or something that's totally independent of the whole structure.
Yeah.
Then you could at least, even if you can't drive on the roads, you can at least, you have your own energy.
But who can afford to buy a Winnebago if
But
you're?
don't those have to be plugged in also?
Oh yeah, yeah. To
yeah,
operate them, you had to plug it in, so it doesn't
You have to
really.
have your own generator.
Yeah. Well, you can't because unless the generator is gas.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness. Mm. Well, I'm just gonna have to pray for those people.
Yeah,
Pray for the government to help them out.
yeah, yeah. I'm not sure, what time. Biden has declared Texas a disaster area, so that means, the availability of federal funding. I don't know, what the state would do, is
Yeah.
planning on doing.
Right. And it's in the middle of COVID, so, I mean,
And it's in the middle of COVID. Yeah. Yeah, and Texas has been one of the states that has been lax and, you know, uh, has opened up very liberally.